If you are preparing your own returns, it really is possible to incur a sizable AMT liability due to a mistake. And there are a number of areas that we'd like you to be sensitive to so that you're not unnecessarily paying a tax liability. Hello, I'm Greg Barber, Director and Tax Manager with EWM Tax Solutions. We're going to have a conversation today that helps you make a little bit of sense of the alternative minimum tax. So, why do you need to know about the alternative minimum tax, or AMT as it's commonly referred to? The alternative minimum tax may actually be a required component in your 1040 filing, so that's an important reason. Much of the AMT is not terribly complex though, and as a consequence, if people understand a fair amount about it, a little bit about it, they might be able to muddle their way through it on their own. If you are preparing your own returns, it really is possible to incur a sizable AMT liability due to a mistake. And there are a number of areas that we'd like you to be sensitive to so that you're not unnecessarily paying a tax liability. So what's the AMT and why do we have it? In its earliest existence, the AMT tax code dates back to the 1960s. It had a really clear, necessary directive of trying to prevent excessive use of legal tax loopholes that effectively let people avoid paying a fair amount of tax. So why does the AMT exist? Initially, it was there to correct what were considered to be injustices with some taxpayers that made, well, we'll say a little more than ample use of legal loopholes. Just not considered to be fair when people are digging in the cookie jar and taking a bunch. It functions as a parallel tax system next to what we call the 1040. It follows a separate set of rules, and in the end, if the AMT tax is greater than your regular tax, you must pay the AMT. Why does it continue to exist if some of those old reasons are gone? I'd say that for many reasons, or probably the most common one, is that it began generating revenues that originally were not intended to be targeted, but at this point, the service and the government are somewhat dependent upon the revenue. And to explain a little bit, what I'll tell you is over a couple decades, regular taxes dropped while a lot of the AMT rules remained the same. And as that gap got wider, it caused more and more people to fall within the alternative minimum tax, thus paying and generating revenues. So with regard to the alternative minimum tax, what types of things should we be aware of? What can we be looking out for so that we understand whether or not we belong in AMT or maybe there's a mistake or an error in some fashion in our return? You're going to want to be familiar with the types of things that are treated differently in the AMT calculations. The primary differences are the exemption amounts that are afforded different between regular and AMT tax. Another large one is tax depreciation. Very common adjustment. People own rental properties, people own a portion of commercial buildings, maybe an entire building. Depreciation is a large difference, it's common. Other folks have itemized deductions that are perfectly permissible, normal on a typical 1040, but as it relates to the AMT calculation, they're simply different. They're not afforded, or they're not afforded at the same level. Another common example would be stock options, sometimes referred to as incentive stock options, ISOs. Probably the last one that comes up more frequently than folks would expect are oil and gas interests. There are things such as depletion and IDCs that come up in the ownership of those businesses that are commonly different with respect to AMT. So that hits a number of the big differentials. So is there any overall advice that might be useful to someone preparing their own return or somebody trying to comprehend it? Yeah, there are. First, I'd want you to understand that the current tax structures, relatively newer laws, actually create an environment where fewer people should be coming up against AMT. So I would want you to know that if you've never been in it before, it's probably less likely that you would see that tax cropping up now. In addition, much of the AMT is not that complex. So I would encourage you to get familiar with it and maybe try working through it if you can. However, I want you to understand that there are areas of complexity, and if you get into a large, sizable difference in a tax filing, and you haven't typically paid, maybe you have paid now, and all of a sudden you're identifying a large AMT tax liability, that's the time to really take a few minutes, look more closely at what you've done, quite possibly seek the advice of a professional, because there can be scenarios where there's a triggering event. And I wouldn't want someone that's preparing their own return to not pick up on that significant event that really they're not certain if they've done things right. And it could be a cumulative effect of a number of years, minor accounting or minor tax errors. So be familiar with the fact that it's necessary to get a qualified professional at times. And often you're going to find you're going to get better results, even considering the costs. Second, much of the AMT is not terribly complex, but you could risk getting a sort of sizable AMT liability when preparing your own returns. And I want that to be a trigger of a possible error. If you get in that circumstance, understand that it might be the time to bring in a qualified professional, at least to consult them, maybe not to prepare the return, but try and sanity test what you're doing. So the reason I make that comment is over the course of my career, some of the largest mistakes I've actually seen involved people that were preparing their own tax returns. And they were actually making relatively small, if not very small, ongoing calculation errors that upon a sale or a triggering event with respect to their taxes, the errors had a cumulative effect. And in a nutshell, it became a large mistake in that circumstance. And so if you have a large AMT liability, again, please consider seeking qualified advice. And understand that the tax law is constantly in flux. AMT is no different than many other areas. There's changes often. And so make sure that as you're working through your tax circumstances, that you're using only the latest, most current tax law, forms, and research. Otherwise, the pitfalls can be obvious. At EWM Tax Solutions, we really want to help you get the complex pieces of your financial life working together so that you can earn more, keep more, and live more. Feel free to contact us, speak with a team member about your tax planning endeavors and wealth building goals. I want to thank you for listening and learning, and we most definitely look forward to hearing from you.